thank you very much for the nice and warm welcome and the friendly words you found for my person. I really appreciate to be here, and it's very nice to be here after 4 years. Last time I've been here was in 95, and I'm also very glad to see that there wasn't much of change in Huntsville. So it's very nice to come back and to feel at home. At least I had the impression I know everything what I had seen back then, and what I will talk about is a bit what I found in the Saturday issue of the Huntsville newspaper. I read there that I will talk about changes and in particular related to policing and what developed in terms of policing and philosophies and practices in this decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And exactly that's exactly what I will do. I will collapse what I will present in 4 main points. The first is a very short description of what Germany is like. I will describe a bit the German system, and then I will go a bit into describing the German organization of police and policing in order to give some basic information on Germany and German police. Then I would like to go a bit into 2 changes, structural changes, which occurred and which affected policing in Germany very much. As a third point, I thought about discussing a bit those changes in crime control and crime problems, which also affected policing styles and policing philosophies in the 90s, although these changes are not necessarily related to the fall of the Berlin Wall and related issues. And finally, I would like to go into changes in philosophies and practices as regards German police and policing in Germany. So let me start with the first point, Germany. What is Germany? Germany is since 1990 a unified country which consists of slightly over 80 million people, inhabitants. And these 80 million people include some 8 million foreign nationals, mainly from Turkey, but also from all over Europe and the rest of the world. Moreover, among these 80 million, there's a group of 3 million so-called ethnic Germans from the former Soviet Union, who came at the end of the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakdown of the Iron Curtain, to re-immigrate to Germany. Most of them do not speak German, but they speak Russian. And so in Germany, these people are sometimes also called the Russians. Although basically they are German, they have adopted German citizenship, but they form a very distinct subgroup in Germany since in the 90s. The political system in Germany, and that is, I think, also interesting and very important for understanding and policing, crime control in general. Germany is a federal system. It is made up out of 16 independent states with their own political system, own parliaments, ministries of interior, justice, and so on. And there's a federal system. You will be familiar with that. And as the capital has moved from Bonn to Berlin, is now also an expression of the federal republics, the federal level having slipped finally in a real metropolitan area. The distinction between federal level and the state level is important insofar as in the area of criminal law and criminal justice, almost all statutes, all laws are federal laws. That means the federal legislature, the federal parliament creates laws, but law enforcement and justice administration, including police, is entrusted to the state level. So the federal level has nothing to do with, or almost nothing to do with, law enforcement. That gives the states a very, very important position in the criminal justice system at large, and what comes up with this type of federal system is, in some fields, enormous, pronounced differences in law enforcement styles. So that is very marked, in particular in those fields where there are conflicts with sensitive issues, for example drugs, illicit drugs. We find that in the north of Germany, in the northern states, the justice administration system has issued non-prosecution guidelines demanding from public prosecutors not to prosecute cannabis offenses below 30 grams of cannabis, while in the south almost every cannabis offense will be prosecuted independent from the amount which is involved. So there's an enormous potential of differences, policing and administrating justice, coming up with this federal system. In order to alleviate a bit these problems, ministers of justice and the interior meet 2-3 times per year in order to discuss differences in policing, differences in justice administration, and to discuss also whether it's possible to develop common and uniform guidelines. But it's rather rare that those common guidelines are really developed and implemented, as they are between the states. I think rather important differences in terms of culture and whole social context, which is also important in influencing policing and justice administration. So we have not a uniform system, but a very, very very distinct systems which pursue their own policies, their own values and interests. As regards police and organization of police, I mentioned that police and policing is essentially something which is done under the responsibility of the state ministries of the interior and the state's ministries of justice. There's also a federal level of policing, but that is rather small and restricted to certain issues. To give you some basic information on how police looks like in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, today, there's a total of today of some 280,000 police in the whole of Germany. 280,000 police, and that refers to all positions which are available in the police authorities. That means that one police officer per approximately 300 inhabitants is available. But that doesn't mean that there's also one police officer on the street per 300 inhabitants. When looking how many police are out on the streets at any time of the day, we find that recent research confirmed that it's one police officer for every 10,000 inhabitants who is out on the street doing policing at any time of the day and the month and the year. So that points to a certain problem as regards the total and how many of these police are on the street and serving the public. Research has pointed also out that in order to put one additional police officer on the street, you have to hire 15 additional police officers, and that means that you have to invest some 600,000 US dollars to put one additional police on the street and to make him or her operational. That is pointing towards problems which come up with costs and cost-benefit analysis, but it's I think some basic information which describes a bit costs of police, the nature of policing, and how policing in general is organized. Police forces within the states in Germany, they are organized in a very simple way. There are 4 branches within German police. That is uniform police or order police. That is the main body of police. I think some 70% of the total of police, they belong to the uniform police. And there's plainclothes or criminal police responsible for investigation of crimes. And then there's something, I'm not sure whether that exists in common law systems, something we call standby police. That is mainly police forces which are concentrated in camps, on the one hand for educational and training purposes, on the other hand to have to be able to provide for police forces, for significant police forces in case of major unrests, social unrests or terrorist problems and so on. And the 4th branch concerns something in Germany which is called in German river police, police who are responsible for patrolling rivers, lakes, and these 4 branches make up the police under the authority of the single states. The federal police is not very important in terms of numbers, absolute numbers. The federal police concerns first of all the Federal Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the Bundeskriminalamt, with some 4,000 police officers. The tasks of this federal police is restricted to collection of intelligence, international cooperation, in particular cooperation via Interpol, and investigation of major cross-border crime cases, terrorist activities, which have out of their very nature cannot be handled and dealt with by local state police. But you can see from totals that federal police is only a very minor part of police at large. Have 280,000 police officers, that is a total, and out of them 4,000 belong to this federal level. Finally, there is something like federal border police, that is in German the Bundesgrenzschutz, with some 24,000 police officers responsible for patrolling borders. Their task has become a bit difficult because I will talk about that a bit later. One of the structural changes in Europe and affecting in particular Germany and German policing concerns abolition of border controls. So the changes, the structural changes which have affected policing, and I mentioned that a second ago, concerns first of all something which in Europe is a rather well-known topic, the Schengen agreements. The Schengen agreements of 85 and 90, agreements which on the European level deal with abolition of border controls within the framework of the European Union. So these Schengen agreements have been put into effect 3 years ago with the consequence, with the result that between a selection of European countries, border controls have been abolished completely. That means these countries which have until now become members or parties to the Schengen Convention and the Schengen agreements, that is Germany, France, Italy, Austria, Holland, Belgium and Spain. These countries do not control their respective borders with other parties to these conventions. In exchange for that, the Schengen agreements provide for a common policy in 3 fields, and that means harmonization of immigration laws, harmonization of gun control, and harmonization of drug laws. And with that, the abolition of border and possible consequences of abolition of border should be responded to. The second structural change concerns German reunification. And I read during the last years sometimes American newspapers and other European countries' newspapers, and what was always highlighted, and what was highlighted also in the introduction, is that there is still a gap between East and West in terms of clashes of cultures, different cultures. And that is on the one hand true. There are still different cultures in terms of people, individuals, groups, which have been raised differently, raised in different contexts, along different political, cultural values and so on. But on the other hand, the problems which came out of German reunification are, in my opinion, not that much linked to these cultural differences. But there was one problem which is still one of the biggest problems coming out of German reunification, that is money. Money and resources. That's very, very frankly spoken, the biggest problem. The cultural differences, cultural conflicts, and what else, that can be overcome. That's what we observe also in the West. There's big cultural differences, and I discussed that a bit during lunch with some of you, there's big cultural differences between Bavarians and people from Hamburg or Prussians, and I mean, these differences between these groups are not bigger than those coming out of differences between people living in the East and people living in the West. But the money problem of resources is still prevailing, and that is something which has a very big impact on police and policing. Because on the one hand, with German reunification, the West took over responsibility for establishing a completely new system of police organizations, justice, and so on. On the other hand, with that responsibility, with that political responsibility, came along duties to fund all these new organizations, all these structural changes. And that is an annual budget of some 100 billion Deutschmark, which is transferred to the East from the West. That means approximately 55 billion US dollars annually are transferred to the East in order to fund all the structural changes which are necessary to speed up the process of development and to try to balance East and West. But that means also that police forces in general are subject to serious reductions in budgets, as has been the case, or as is the case for the criminal justice system at large. So these two structural changes have affected police and policing very heavily, and I would like to go a bit into some of the problems associated with abolition of border controls. What has been criticized, in particular on the side of police with abolition of border controls, is that police argue that abolition of border controls will lead to deficits in security. Borders are seen to represent strategical points where problems can be identified, crime suspects can be identified, where people can be restricted from entering the territory and to commit crimes in Germany. But although this point was highlighted very much during the 80s when the Schengen agreements were developed, there is no research until now which could identify how much crime can be prevented through establishing borders and border controls. I mean, I think police have exaggerated the importance of borders in crime control for whatever reason, but it is very clear in a European context where millions and millions of people every day cross borders, because there's a lot of borders to be crossed in Europe, that control in terms of physical control of individuals, individual cars and so on, cannot be put into effect, cannot be managed in order to control actually people who are considering to commit crimes from entering the territory of Germany. So what type of responses have been developed? Border controls have been abolished, and what was introduced that is quite interesting is something police have been always very interested in. Some of the German states, in particular Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, have introduced new police powers. And that means in a zone 15 miles away from the former border to France, Austria, and so on, police may implement and carry through random stop and search procedures. They may, without any reason, without any suspicion, stop cars, individuals, and control identity, whatever, can search cars, can search persons, individuals. So, in exchange for abolition of border controls, which was said to create serious deficits, new powers for police have been introduced, which give police much more power in controlling individuals than have had custom officials at the former border. Because this type of control deployed in a very large zone is much more important, and it can be extended to more people than is possible at a border. Because it's not only people who cross the border who can be subject to random stop and search procedures, but anyone who is found in this 15-mile zone. That was one response. The other response has been police cooperation, and that has emerged as an issue since quite some time. On a European level, and I think you're familiar with that, there's been a European criminal investigation unit established on the basis of the Schengen Agreement and the Maastricht Treaty in The Hague. That is one a response on the perceived need of police cooperation. The other, and that is perhaps more important, concerns the emergence of a lot of a multitude of local schemes of cooperation, very local schemes of cooperation between French and Baden-Württemberg police, Austrian and Bavarian police, and so on. So that gives a very chaotic picture, looking at these various types of cooperation, and this picture is displaying also one of the big problems in police cooperation, because this picture displays the differences which are available between French police and German police, not only in terms of differences in organization and laws, but also in terms of cultures, of professional attitudes, and so on, and last but not least, differences and problems coming out of different languages and language problems. So these structural changes, abolition of border controls and German reunification, have affected policing, and they have contributed to changes I will talk a bit about later. So the third point: what basic changes have affected police and policing in the 90s? I would like to summarize that in 8 points. First, there was a very, very heavy increase in crime, in police recorded crime. And this increase can be located between 90 and 95. There had been an increase in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think in most countries, most industrialized countries and modern societies, this increase can be observed. And then there has been a period of not decrease, but this increase leveled off, and in the 80s there was no discussion of increasing crime rates. With abolition of the Berlin Wall falling, and with opening the former Iron Curtain, there was this dramatic increase of crime. And that led to an increase from some 6,000 crimes recorded per 100,000 of the population to a bit more than 8,000 in 98. So it's a quite significant increase within a rather short period of time, which obviously was a result or a consequence of which was associated with opening borders and with these dramatic changes going on in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Second, what happened then is a dramatic increase in fear of crime. And that is especially pronounced in the east of Germany. In the east of Germany, although crime rates did not go up that rapidly, and crime rates in the east are still below crime rates observed in the west, fear of crime jumped up, and with the ordinary measures of fear of crime in studies on victimization and the fear of crime, we found that East Germans experience double the fear that is experienced in the West, although the crime rate is higher in the West. And that must obviously be a response not to actual developments in crime and crime control. That is obviously related to the changes which were going on in the economic field, in the political system. Obviously, these times of rapid changes in economy with feelings of insecurity as regards employment, as regards the future. Obviously, these processes, these changes are associated with fear of crime reaching considerable amounts. So that leveled off in the mid-90s, and today the fear of crime in the East has adjusted to the levels observed in the West. So it's actually a response to a reunification and those processes initiated through reunification. Third, what can be observed then that is a process which commenced already in the 80s, is a sharp increase in the number of foreign nationals who are suspected of having committed a crime, and a growing number of illegal immigrants and migrant offenders, cross-border offenders. That is something which has been always made a topic of concern in the Federal Republic of Germany, but in the 90s that increase was felt very much, in particular associated with a sharp increase in the number of asylum seekers coming to Germany, and that number reached a certain peak in '93 with some 400,000 people from outside Germany seeking asylum in Germany. So these processes obviously developed into a rate of foreign nationals of some 30 to 33%. Every third suspect is a foreign national. So this rate is calculated from the national police statistics. In metropolitan areas, this proportion is much higher. And the field of young offenders, in Frankfurt, for example, 2/3 of young offenders under the age of 20 are foreign nationals. So the average police officer arresting and processing a juvenile criminal case is not dealing with a German national, but with a foreign national, which brings in a lot of problems of communication and the like. So that has led to, to the necessity of a complete revision of very basics of policing and initiating criminal proceedings in Germany, because the traditional approach of policing and criminal justice was that the average offender is a German national. That was true in the 60s, that was true in the 70s, but that changed obviously in the 80s and in the 90s. In some fields, in some areas, the reversal comes through. It is, on the average, a foreign national who comes to the attention of police and must be interviewed or taken care of. I mean, we know very well what happened, what contributed to this development in the population of offenders, suspects, and so on. There's three conditions for this process. First, what we observe is that the second and third generations of those immigrants of the 60s, 50s, and 60s, that these generations, the subsequent generations, that they experience a much higher crime load than the first wave or first generation of immigrants. That has obviously to do with young foreign people or young immigrants who are for whom it's very difficult to integrate. In particular, as regards the labor market. As immigrants, newly arriving immigrants, are obviously experiences a lot of problems of unemployment and finding access to the labor market, and as second, third generations of immigrants from the 50s and 60s also experiences these problems. There's a problem of social integration, of integrating these people, these minorities, into mainstream society. And there the labor market is decisive. And the labor market today is characterized through what has been called the loss of labor. I mean, low-skilled jobs are not available anymore, and low-skilled jobs were obviously very important for immigrants everywhere, and at least throughout the 60s and 70s. Today, immigrants, they cannot find any low-skilled jobs anymore, because there are no low-skilled jobs in the German and in the European labor markets. So what comes up here is the problem of black markets, of informal and shadow economies, and a lot of young immigrants go into these shadow economies with considerable risks of getting involved with drugs, with prostitution, with all types of illicit activities, which create the risk of becoming a suspect and being confronted with police. A second cause or a second condition leading to this development in the increase of foreign nationals as suspects in the German criminal justice system concerns migration, which was from east to the west. And that is something which was not possible until 1991 with this Iron Curtain. That was a very, very safe border which prevented that people from the East with very poor economies came to Western European countries. So all of a sudden, in 1991, this Iron Curtain fell down and came down. And what happened is, I think, very easily understood. That that was experienced in Berlin, for example. In Berlin, between 90 and 91, the number of shoplifting increased from one year to the other, from 30,000 to 60,000 shoplifting cases. And most of this increase was due to people coming from Poland, Czech Republic, to these metropolitan areas and getting caught in shoplifting activities. So what we have here is something which can be attributed to migrating populations, not immigration. These people are not immigrants, but these are people who come for a weekend, for one day, for 2 days to the neighboring country in order to, not to steal, but during these 2-3 days there is a certain risk of becoming involved in illegal activities. So that is obviously due to the enormous gap still experienced between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Economic conditions are still very poor in the east of Europe, and that attracts, that pulls, that pushes, and the opportunities in the West, they pull these people across the former border. That is the second condition which is important. The third concerns something which we have to consider today with globalization of economies. What has been globalized already in the 80s and what has developed then very rapidly in the 90s is integration of subcultures, integration of black markets, integration of prostitution markets and so on. What we observe is that in all European countries there are enormous black markets which attract people from Colombia, from Africa, Nigerians, heroin distribution, cocaine distribution, prostitution, and all that attracts people, not because there is a certain will or wish to immigrate, but it's participation in black markets, which is obviously important in attracting people who at the same time commit then criminal offenses. So we have these three lines in explaining this development, and that obviously leads to a very serious development as regards police and policing, in particular also as regards police training and education. Then the fourth point concerns organized crime and organized cross-border crime, gangs, criminal gangs. That is something which obviously developed also very rapidly in the 90s, and that is related a bit to the emergence of sophisticated crime. During the 50s and 60s, the ordinary police officer had to do with, say, low-profile crimes, and not very complicated in understanding, not very complicated in evidence, and that changed obviously also very significantly. Today, a range of economic crimes, in particular fraud crimes, on the other hand, organized crime in terms of division of labor and crimes where rational behavior is at the center becomes more important, and that is contributing enormously to the workload of police in investigating these types of crimes. What is relevant with cross-border criminal activities is that at least two systems are involved with normally differing legal frameworks, differing powers of police, and therefore problems as regards judicial cooperation in prosecution and in processing cases through the trial. The sixth point concerns something which obviously is associated with German reunification, and that refers to hate violence and hate crimes. And that again relates to problems conflicts between ethnicities. Hate crimes or hate violence was not a big phenomenon in the 70s, 80s. That was rapidly increasing at the beginning of the 90s, and that reached a peak in 92, 93 with several thousand hate violence crimes recorded by police. What is important here, I think, is not the crimes as such, the individual act, but the problem for police and policing concerns obviously that with such type of crimes, sensitive and conflictual areas have to be approached by police, and that puts police in a very precarious position because they are confronted with two ethnicities, with two races, or with conflicts where police themselves can get involved very easily. And that relates to another point which in the 90s has, in particular by police, made a topic. Police more and more feels that they themselves are drawn into social conflicts. They are drawn into social conflicts, into conflicts between groups, be these conflicts political conflicts, racial conflicts, cultural conflicts, and as they argue, as police argue, politics do nothing in order to avoid these conflicts, and they send us into these conflicts in order to solve them. That puts us in a very difficult, an extremely difficult position, and that's obviously why, according to police statements, a lot of police officers feel very frustrated, a high level of frustration with the current work, not because the workload is too high, but the type of work, the confrontation with these types of conflicts. And that is actually different, because a police officer in the 60s hadn't to argue with a suspect that the suspicion had arisen only because the offender was of that and that race or of that and that ethnicity. That wasn't a problem back then, but today a police officer has to deal with this type of question. And you may have noticed that through media coverage during the last 5-6 years. In the 90s, a lot of media reports covered the question of police violence against ethnic minorities, against racial minorities, and that has contributed to a situation where police officers obviously feel frustrated and always in confrontation with these types of social and ethnic conflicts. And that extends to other sensitive areas. We have the gender issue in certain types of crimes. There is the issue of poor and rich people, and so on. All these conflicts, all these areas come up and put police in a difficult position. The last point concerns something which also is a product of the 90s. That is, the focus was put again on disorder problems. And that is a certain parallel to what can be found also in some of the North American metropolitan areas. That is a bit referring to that zero tolerance policing. Research and police came up with findings that the public was not concerned that much with big crime, like big fraudulent schemes or drug trafficking, cocaine trafficking, or terrorist activities, but the public was concerned with everyday disorders on the streets, threats made by young people, street crime. That's very, very, this everyday problems encountered by most of our fellow citizens. So that served to redirect attention to, let's say, low-profile crimes or mere disorder phenomenon. And that coincided with a development we observed since also the beginning of the 90s, and which is not easily understood. We have a very dramatic increase in juvenile suspects in two fields. That is street robbery and that is assault on the street. Street crimes are among young people increasing heavily in the 90s. These developments are, at least according to research which was done until now, cannot be understood. Might be, and that is, I think, a very interesting approach. It could be, and I have some hints to that from cohort research we do on Baden-Württemberg youth. Might be that a gang problem comes up again, and a problem of gangs increasing in number. Because what we see also is, as police are recording crime along two lines, they count suspects and they count criminal offenses. What we find is that the number of offenses, assault and street robbery, is not increasing very much. What goes up is the number of suspects. So what we know from this cohort research I mentioned is that the number of young people involved in one street robbery or in one assault on other young people, that is growing in the 90s. So that points obviously to a new gang problem or gang phenomenon, which comes up obviously in metropolitan areas. So the last and the fourth point I would like to raise concerns the changes in philosophies. What changes in philosophies and policing can be addressed? I think I would like to summarize this in 7 points. First, there is a shift from crime control perspectives to information brokering and service delivery or service orientation in German police. And that is not difficult to understand. I think that is everywhere research came up with the same results. Although in media coverage, in politicians' coverage of police work, of policing, law enforcement plays the crucial role. The activities of police officers is not at all characterized by law enforcement. Recent research on police showed that in Germany, on the average, a police officer arrests one offender every 6 weeks. Every 6 weeks. And this arrest that is done within 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour. So law enforcement for the average police officer does not play a central role. What is much more important for police, and what takes a big proportion of their activities, professional activities, is collecting information, giving information to the public, providing services in terms of traffic regulation and all that, traffic accidents, getting involved in traffic accidents. This type of activities obviously play the major role in the daily activities of police. That is why a shift towards this service part of the police role obviously occurred, and police are, I think, they do the right thing in this in this field. They are shifting attention away from crime control towards these services they provide, and that is can be seen also in the attempts on the side of police of presenting their activities in the public, in the media. They obviously want to go away from this picture of police which is highlighting crime control and law enforcement. A second point which reflects changes in philosophies on the one hand and changes in police practices is related to new concern for evaluation and cost benefit. That was never a big issue in most European countries, including Germany. That came up very rapidly in the 90s with cutting budgets, with less and less resources available in terms of staff and money. The problem came up: how can we? What should we do? Where should we put the resources which are available? At what cost and at what benefits? And how do we evaluate then this cost-benefit ratio? How do we evaluate our own activities in order to address also the policymakers and the public, and to be able to demonstrate that policing has some impact on that and that and that, and that these resources invested into policing have been invested with some measurable effect. So what we observe today in German police bodies is the search for evaluation criteria. That is a very important thing. There's a big discussion going on that. How should police and policing be evaluated? What is the major criteria which are important for measuring police, the impact of police and policing on society, on safety and all that? So that is a very big issue, and that is not settled at all, but we see that more and more police organizations, police forces come up, and that is also reflecting sort of very profound change in terms of attitudes. Police forces in the 70s as have been university professors in the 80s and the 90s, been very reluctant as regards evaluation. They always said, our work cannot be evaluated. What we do, that is either something we do for peace in society. How do we measure peace in society, order and all that? And professors, they argue, we do research, we want to find the truth. How should we measure that? That cannot be measured, such work cannot be measured. So these times are gone. Today we find more and more people, they come up themselves and say, I want to be evaluated. Because they know, without evaluation, no money, no resources. The policymakers, they have understood not only the message which lies in evaluation, but they have understood that evaluation is also providing for very good arguments to cut budgets. Because for policymakers, most policymakers, they do not understand evaluation research. They do not understand theory, they do not understand methodology. That is, for them, that's not the most important part of the story. The most important part for them is, gives that an argument to cut costs in certain parts of society. So that has contributed to these changes. And police, I have to say that they are among the first who come up and say, we are ready for evaluation. We want to be evaluated. That's different, for example, from attitudes still experienced in the public prosecution services or in the court system. But that is pointing to profound changes in attitudes and decision-making patterns. A third change in Germany was visible with community policing, which was introduced as an idea also in the 90s. Very late compared to other European countries. Community policing has then led to the creation of so-called crime prevention councils on a city level, where police are contributing in terms of staff and information. I am not sure whether this community crime prevention or community policing approaches are actually more than mere rhetoric, more than mere talking about how crime can be prevented or how police can re-establish bonds and links to the community. Because what we see, on the other hand, and that has to do with costs, is that although many of these community crime prevention councils have been founded, resources or money has not been invested in that. So it's more, I think, something which has to do with a certain discourse on crime control and police and the relationship between the public and police, and not that much with actual changes. But community policing as a topic has become very important, as has become community at large. But I'm not sure whether that will lead to something. I'm rather pessimistic, I must admit, because with community, I think it's not more than a tautology, because community, whether it is related to police and policing or to crime and prevention and so on, is cause and result. So it's pointing towards the causes of some problematic developments, and it's pointing at the same time to the solution. So there's something wrong with that. At least I'm not. I didn't see until now that theoretically that can be elaborated into dependent and independent variables. So the fourth point concerns police becoming proactive and preventive, and that has to do with, I think, rather important changes which took place in the procedural field and also in the field of traditional police laws, which during the 90s created a lot of new investigative techniques which have been deployed and which have been spread very, very rapidly and widely, and which make certain differences insofar as the traditional strong link between prosecution and justice on the one hand, and police as an investigating, controlling authority on the other hand, breaks up. These new investigative techniques make police work more and more independent from the rest of the justice system. Because what essentially takes place with these new investigative methods is that police goes into the field of pre-suspicion. Normally, investigative techniques are needed if suspicion initiates proceedings. But with these new investigative techniques, suspicion should be identified first. So there is no suspicion besides the general knowledge that at any time, at any place, crimes will be committed. And police have to go out and to look who and where crimes are committed. So that separates police and prosecution and the courts from in that very important field. And that is related to another point which is rather significant for the current status and position of German police. German police have become more self-conscious, and they have become they recognize their own importance in the field, in the system of criminal justice. Police, according to the German criminal procedural law, was always dependent on the public prosecutor. The public prosecutor controls, according to the principle of legality, the whole of the criminal procedure. Police have no discretion at all in making decisions during investigation, during the investigative or the criminal procedure at large. So police today come up and say, on the one hand, we have no legal powers at all to stop, for example, criminal investigation proceedings. On the other hand, we do all the work, and we are the pillar of the criminal justice system. So what we want now is powers to decide upon ending procedures. And that is something which creates, of course, conflicts with the public prosecution services, because public prosecution services are, until now, in the position to dismiss cases and to stop proceedings. Then, what has to be noted is the introduction of privatization and market mechanisms in police work and police organization. That is something which is also related to the question of private police and private policing, which has become quite important in Germany. We have, I mentioned these 280,000 public police officers. There is current estimates put private police at some 200,000 people involved with private policing. So it's considerable private security, private policing business which has developed, and there's a certain a need for German police to define, on the one hand, their role, their own role, vis-à-vis private police, and the role and function private police should play in maintaining order and all that. And there's also a very interesting development during the 70s and still in the 80s. Public police, they were very reluctant in accepting private police. Public police always argued, with private police we have a serious problem as regards the monopoly of violence, the monopoly of power. Today we find that these attitudes have completely changed. There is a clear division of labor, and there's a clear acceptance of the idea of private police emerging within public police. So that has to do obviously also with the acceptance of privatization of public police, insofar as there's a ongoing introduction of market mechanisms within public police themselves. So finally, the final point I would like to raise concerns something which I mentioned earlier, the general philosophy which underlies policing. And I mentioned something which was invented in New York, a zero tolerance concept. That idea was very much discussed in German police, and there have been some police officers advocating such a zero tolerance approach, in particular as regards these disorder problems which I mentioned. But in general, I think that there's a clear majority, not only in the criminal justice system at large and in political parties, but in particular also within police forces, not to adopt zero tolerance policies, but to stick with an approach. I'm not sure whether that approach should be called a soft approach to social conflicts, and to do something which is very much traditional and very much a very essential part of traditional policing, that is to attempt to maintain order and peace in society. And with that, something will be further developed, which played considerable role in discussions in the 70s and 80s. That is, police have to try to avoid escalation of social conflicts. And one very important part of police and policing is the serious risk of escalation. And I think German police is doing very well, trying to maximize this avoidance of escalation and to stick to this traditional approach which aims at maintaining peace in society. Thank you very much.